Hello, and welcome back to Chords and Queens, the podcast dedicated to celebrating and amplifying the extraordinary work of female composers and musicians throughout history. I'm your host, Jennifer Athen, and I created this show because these remarkable artists and their groundbreaking works deserve to be heard, studied, and celebrated. Each episode will explore the lives, music, and lasting impact of the women who shaped the world of classical music. And today we're discussing the English composer Ruth Gipps. Ruth Gipps was a powerhouse of talent with a musical spirit that simply refused to be tamed. In 1999, she was awarded an MBE for her remarkable impact on the world of music, not just as a composer, but also as a conductor, pianist, oboist, orchestra founder, and teacher. Even Sir Hugh Allen, the director of the Royal College of Music, once remarked that she would go far because she is obstinate. She is damned obstinate. And don't worry if you've never heard of that word, it's basically just a fancy way of saying she's stubborn. And in Ruth's case, that stubborn streak probably allowed her to have the career that she did. It truly fueled her ambition, helped her break down some of the barriers that came with being a woman in music at that time, and even allowed her to carve out not just one, but several successful careers along different musical paths. So let's dive into her story, if you will. From child prodigy to an uncompromising, sometimes controversial, yet undeniable force in English classical music. So our story begins in Bexhill-on-Sea in Sussex, England, and Ruth Dorothy Louisa Gipps is born on February 20th, 1921. Her mother, Helene, was a talented piano player who won a place at the Frankfurt Conservatoire at the age of only 13, and that's where she met Ruth's father, Brian, who was studying violin there. Helene later became a music teacher and the founder and principal of the Bexhill School of Music, creating an inherently musical environment for young Ruth. But if you're thinking, mother's a music teacher, this must mean that she's going to be one of those pushy stage mums that forces their kid into music and practicing scales for 10 hours a day. Well, surprisingly, you would actually be wrong this time, because even Ruth actually mentions by her own account that she didn't grow up with pushy parents, and in fact, when discussing growing up and practicing music, she says, quote, "I found it incomprehensible that anybody shouldn't enjoy every minute of playing," end quote, which said no musician ever, or so I thought. But apparently Ruth couldn't get enough of practicing. She was a true musical prodigy, and her talent was evident even early on as she began her piano studies with her mother on her 5th birthday, which I'm sure is something loads of 5-year-olds ask for on their 5th birthday. Her public debut as a pianist came at the tender age of 5, and by aged 8, she had already composed her first prize-winning work, a short piano piece called The Fairy Shoemaker. Although she encountered a bit of drama with it, and it even sparked some controversy as some skeptical reviewers actually suggested that it must have been her mother that was the one true composer of this piece. And this sort of skepticism is really nothing new when it comes to children composing music. I believe that even young Mozart's ability to compose music at such an early stage in their life was called into question. And actually, music historian Charles Burnley notes the whole skepticism that often surrounds child prodigies. So it's good to know it wasn't just young Ruth experiencing this sort of slander. It seems to really come with the territory of being a young and gifted composer. Despite this early bit of drama though, Ruth continued to compose, and by age 10 she was performing her own solo works and appearing as a concert soloist in her hometown. However, if you were thinking, wow, her early life sounds really great. She loves playing and writing music, she's not got toxic parents that are forcing her to practice all the time, what could possibly be wrong? She must have the most idyllic childhood. Well, her extraordinary musical gifts also set her apart, and not always in a good way. From a young age, she felt like a bit of an outsider, and she openly admitted that she hated school, saying she was teased and picked on at just about every opportunity. Ruth knew she was different, and so did the other kids her age, especially the young girls whom she confessed she struggled to get along with as they were too gossipy, too cruel, and not exactly welcoming to someone marching to the beat of her own drum. Music pun definitely intended there. She was home educated through secondary school, allowing her to focus entirely on music. In 1937, at just 16 years old, she entered the Royal College of Music. She didn't initially want to attend the RCM, though instead she wanted to study with pianist Solomon Cutler, and he agreed. However, her family couldn't actually afford it, so she had to attend the RCM instead. There, she pursued both composition and piano, studying oboe with Léon Goossens, piano with Arthur Alexander, and composition with the esteemed Ralph Vaughan Williams and Gordon Jacob. One of her earliest and most notable successes came when her symphonic tone poem called Knight in Armour was premiered by Sir Henry Wood at the last night of the proms in 1942. This was a significant achievement for the then 21-year-old composer. The piece itself, I believe, was composed around 1940 when she was still in her late teens, and it became one of her first major successes. It was inspired by Rembrandt's painting The Young Warrior, as well as the broader medieval imagery of knights and chivalry. The piece combines bold, ceremonial brass writing with moments of delicacy, including tender solos for oboe and cor anglais that really highlight the instruments she herself played, which haven't we all been there as composers? You go, oh, I play this. I know how to write for this. I will do nothing but that, and only that. This early success really helped establish Ruth as a composer to watch, and her music quickly developed a distinctive voice, described as characterful, playful, and unashamedly romantic. Speaking of romance, though, it was around this time that Ruth met her future husband, Robert Baker, when he played the clarinet in the premiere performance of her quintet for oboe, clarinet, and string trio at Wigmore Hall in 1941, while she was still a student, and the couple would later be married in 1942. Her husband Robert, though, was not merely a spouse, but perhaps a vital part of Ruth's musical world and story. Most notably, she dedicated her clarinet concerto to him. Written with his playing in mind, the concerto reveals both her deep understanding of the clarinet's expressive character and what I assume must have been her affection for Robert. The solo line explores the instrument's lyrical warmth, its nimble brilliance, and its melancholic colours. It was first performed at the Royal College of Music in 1941 with Baker himself as soloist, giving the premiere a profoundly personal dimension. Although an early work, it already really demonstrates Ruth's instinctive feel for orchestral colour and balance, ensuring the clarinet speaks naturally above the ensemble rather than struggling against it. The dedication is far more than a polite nod. It reflects the personal and artistic bond at the heart of their relationship. A real connection that I'm sure shaped both of their lives. Through this concerto, Robert is immortalized, not only as Ruth Gipps' husband, but also as her collaborator and muse, his artistry embedded in the very notes of her music. And what's more romantic than that? During the early years of their marriage, Robert was called up to the RAF for wartime service, which meant that parts of their early married life were spent separated by war. But Ruth, she kept busy. By 1945, though she had already written 2 symphonies, and these early war years saw Ruth further her studies at Durham University, when at 26 she became the youngest British woman to receive a doctorate in music for her choral work, The Cat, which, let's really dive into more information about this piece, is a cantata written by Ruth in 1947, while heavily pregnant, might I add. It's scored for contralto, baritone soloists, double mixed chorus, and full orchestra, and it draws on texts from a variety of different sources, including gospel writings. The work was praised for its vitality, showing significant development in Ruth's compositional voice, particularly in rhythmic energy and orchestral writing, relative to some of her earlier works. While earlier criticism had noted sort of weaker melodic memorability in her youth, The Cat was widely seen as a mark of maturity and seriousness, and parts of its overture were performed by the City of Birmingham Symphony Orchestra as early as 1948. And it's worth noting that her compositional output during this period was pretty remarkable. In 1947, Ruth and her husband Robert welcomed their only child, a son named Lance Baker, who, perhaps unsurprisingly, given what his parents did for a living, also pursued a life in music, becoming a horn player and later turning his talents to musical arrangement. Some unfortunate events did occur later in her life and career though, when a shoulder injury in her 30s forced her to shift focus. Up until that point, she was a distinguished concert pianist and an accomplished oboist and cor anglais player. She even performed with the City of Birmingham Orchestra under conductor George Weldon, who championed her early music, including the first prominent performances of her first 2 symphonies. But after her performing career was cut short by this shoulder injury, Ruth really dedicated her immense energy to conducting and composition instead. This period also saw her become a staunch anti-modernist in a musical landscape increasingly embracing atonality and serialism. She very famously declared that she viewed, quote, all so-called 12-tone music, so-called serial music, so-called electronic music, and so-called avant-garde music as utter rubbish and indeed a deliberate conning of the public, end quote. That's some harsh, bold words. Yikes. Well, this strong stance, even though she deeply really believed it, well, it kind of put her at odds with contemporary trends and, crucially, with the programming biases of institutions like the BBC, for example, which favoured modern music and consequently neglected her tonal works for decades. Beyond stylistic differences, though, gender prejudice significantly impacted Ruth's career as a composer, and especially in the male-dominated world of conducting. She even endured headlines labeling her a, quote, housewife composer, and dismissive comments about women's natural conservatism in music. She spoke of facing a chorus of disapproval and hatred whenever she stepped onto the podium. One critic, astonishingly, even wrote that, quote, a woman is no more expected to conduct Beethoven's Ninth Symphony than build a great boulder dam. Which is just shocking. In response to these closed doors and prejudices, Ruth's stubborn nature really shone through. And I think that's what I really admire about her, is that fire, that determination. She created her own opportunities by founding her own orchestras. First came the London Repertoire Orchestra in 1955, which started as an idea for essentially a training ground for young musicians fresh from music college, hoping to expose them to a wider range of repertoire. Later, in 1961, she founded the Chanticleer Orchestra, which was a professional ensemble that made a point of including a work by a living composer, often a premiere, in each program. She may have disliked teaching, but enjoyed working with young professionals, launching the careers of notable performers like Julian Lloyd-Webber and pianist Alison Baker through her orchestras. Ruth achieved several significant firsts as a female conductor. She was the first woman to conduct at the Royal Festival Hall in 1957, leading Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, and her own cantata The Cat. In 1969, she became the first woman to conduct her own symphony, The Third, for a BBC broadcast. But despite these groundbreaking achievements, she often felt the need to distance herself from other female composers, even while promoting some of their works, in an attempt to avoid the negative connotations of the, quote, woman label. She frequently portrayed herself as just one of the boys. And during all of my research for this, I found myself empathizing with Ruth's behavior. I don't see it as diva-like or unruly. Rather, I think she understood that if she were a man, she would automatically be revered and wouldn't have to fight so hard just to have her voice heard. Her stubborn, assertive behavior can be seen as a form of self-protection. She didn't want those in power to look at a young woman composer and dismiss her as, oh, it's cute and harmless. She wanted them to see a force to be reckoned with, a woman with passion, strong opinions, and a refusal to be swayed by what was simply popular or expected. In many ways, that assertiveness was her safety blanket. Without her drive and determination, would we even be talking about her today? Would her music have been performed at all? It makes me wonder how many other female composers have been lost to history because they weren't bold or brash to break through and demand recognition for themselves. Not that they had to either. But ran over for now. In addition to her conducting and composing, Ruth held various teaching positions, including at Trinity College London from 1959 to 1966, the Royal College of Music from 67 to 77, and Kingston Polytechnic. In 1967, she was appointed chairwoman of the Composers Guild of Great Britain, but perhaps her most significant accolade and impact on English musical life was recognised in 1981 when she was awarded an MBE. Despite her prolific output of over 70 works, including 5 symphonies, 7 concertos, and numerous chamber and choral pieces, much of her music remained unpublished or unrecorded during her lifetime. Her commitment to a tonal, romantic style, while beautiful and deeply felt, was often seen as dated in comparison to the prevailing modernist trends of the 1950s and beyond. Ruth Gipps passed away on February 23, 1999, at the age of 78 in Eastbourne, following a battle with cancer and a stroke. She was survived by her husband, though, Robert Baker. While her music struggled for recognition during much of her life, the tide was slowly beginning to turn. Recent recording efforts are finally bringing her glorious music to wider audiences. Notable recordings include her orchestral poem Knight in Armour, the beautiful clarinet concertos she composed for her husband, and several of her symphonies. The BBC National Orchestra of Wales under Rumen Gamba has been particularly instrumental in these efforts, and we can now hear works like Symphonies 2, 3 and 4, the oboe concerto and the horn concerto written for her son Lance Baker. Overall, Ruth Gipps was a unique figure, a quote-unquote outsider who embraced that status, believing it was the only way a woman could carve out a significant career in classical music. Her uncompromising vision and a fiery personality were a lifeblood of the 20th century English musical life, embodying its messy, eclectic, and passionate nature. Her enduring contributions to British music across her roles as composer, conductor, performer, teacher, and organizer is immeasurable. The ongoing rediscovery of her work serves as a powerful reminder that music history is constantly being reevaluated, and that reactionary voices of yesterday can become the breath of fresh air of today's audiences. And I really encourage you to seek out and listen to some of Ruth's music if you can, and experience it for yourself, and get to know the characterful, romantic, and profoundly sort of traditional English voice that she brought to the world of classical music. I hope you enjoyed learning a little more about the fantastic composer Ruth Gipps. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you again soon.